Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. This time we are going to be talking about Kung Fu Heroes on the NES. This is an adorable game, and it's got a pretty basic story to it. I know what you're thinking, of course it has a story to it, dummy, but not every arcade did. And when this came out in the mid 80s, it wasn't always common for there to actually be a story for why you're doing what you're doing. It isn't a really in depth story, but at least it's there. The land that this game is taking place in, that is never given a name, it has a princess and a little kingdom in it. Monsters from somewhere decided that they were going to kidnap the princess and 10 treasures as well. So you have to go and save the princess and get all the treasures back. Because apparently the military in this land is either incompetent or non-existent. So yeah, you get to play as one of two characters, Jackie or Lee, and they go out and try to save the princess and get all the shit that was stolen back. And if you're good enough at the game, you can actually do this. If you're not, well, you don't. Kung Fu Heroes is actually the first game in the Super Chinese series, which I didn't know was a series, and I had no idea that it was actually called something completely different from Kung Fu Heroes. Regardless, this is a single-screen beat-em-up game where you fight off waves of enemies. They come in at random points, and you just need to punch them or use your weird flipping butt kick stomp thing. I really have no idea how you kill your enemies with it, but it is kind of fun that they give you a second attack. At seemingly random points, or at least it felt like random points for me, the entryway at the top of the screen will open up, and that's your cue that you need to move on to the next level. I could not figure out what I needed to do in order to actually unlock this, so I'm guessing it's a timed thing, or you defeat a certain number of enemies and then that little opening pops up and you can go into it. There are a handful of items and power-ups that you can get. These grant you more points, they unlock bonus levels, give you extra lives, increase your attack power, and also give you a limited use fireball, so you can shoot things from across the screen. These also kind of come up at random points. You have to blast or break some of the blocks that appear on the screen. They kind of stick out because, well, you can't move past them, and they are a little bit different from the backgrounds, for the most part. They might be a different color, or they might be a rock. Sometimes they're more obvious than others. Yeah, it's a little weird. In order to get to the bonus levels, you need to find a key, and those pop up from breaking certain blocks. Once you pick up the key, then a staircase appears. You go down the staircase, and then you're in an area where you can pick up more points. That's really the big thing with this. You can either try to beat the game, or you can try to set the high score. Either way, you're still playing the same game and doing the same thing. Overall, the gameplay is pretty decent. It was fairly easy to line up your attacks. It's pretty easy to avoid the enemies, even when they start shooting at you. And once you get the hang of it, it's a pretty fun game to go through. It's not anywhere near as good as some of the more modern beat-em-ups, or even those of the 90s and even into the early 2000s, but it is a pretty solid game for what it is. I'm not sure why, but I really love the graphics in this game. They're not going to be for everyone, but this is an art style that I really dig it. It looks a little bit like a cartoon from the 1980s, and yeah, I kind of like this weird chibi art style that they've got going on. The stages aren't anything special, but the character sprites look pretty good. For the NES, the sprites are pretty big and relatively well detailed. It isn't going to blow anyone away, but as far as an NES game goes, this is pretty good looking. You can compare the graphics in some ways to Muscle, even though these are much better than that game, and it doesn't have as much stuttering as Muscle did. There's a lot more going on the screen, and at times you do get like some sprite flickering or something like that, but I think overall it looks pretty good. The blocks that you can break and the items that you can pick up are easy enough to see. They are going to give you a little bit of a challenge, just trying to figure out exactly what's going on at first, but you can see everything fairly well, or at least I could. However, it can be a little bit hard at times to kind of line up your jump attack, just because you're locked on that grid, and it can be a little bit different. This is just a minor problem with the game, but it was something that I wanted to point out. I didn't have too much of an issue with it, but it is there. Overall, I think the game looks pretty good for the time period that it was released, and also the fact that it was a port from the arcades. Even if it does look a little strange to some people, or might not be as graphically impressive as several other NES games, I think it still looks really good. This is a pretty easy game to get into. It's one that I would consider to be just a pick up and play game. You don't need to know too much. There's not like a complicated control scheme to learn, and it's pretty easy to get into it. The controls are pretty good. The graphics, I will say they are decent for the time, even though I really like them a lot more than I probably should. The downside is the gameplay is kind of repetitive. Each stage is basically going to play out the same, even if the enemies will get a little bit more difficult to deal with as you move on. The layouts might change a little bit, you might have some environmental hazards, but overall you're still just doing the same thing each time. They will occasionally throw like a boss figure at you, but even that isn't really changing things up too much. The one-hit deaths can be pretty annoying, but at least you pick up right where you left off. That being said, there are no continues in this. The game does try to kind of mitigate that annoyance a little bit by giving you extra lives, both through points and from finding them on the level. But yeah, having no continues is really annoying. And you kind of just... It's one of those things with older games that just really kind of grinds your gears a little bit, since people are so used to being able to actually continue when they die in most modern games. I think this is a pretty fun single-screen beat-em-up game, and it's kind of fun to see where the genre would kind of start out at with games like this, and where it would eventually end up with some of the more modern stuff, like Streets of Rage 4 or something like that. It can be difficult at times, but I don't think it's too difficult, and it is kind of a fun game to just pick up and play and just see how far you can make it. Kung Fu Heroes is a fun distraction from some of the other games on the NES. It's a game that I discovered in the late 2000s when I was trying to get a complete set of NES games. I bought it, tested it, and then completely forgot about it. Playing it for this review was a fun experience. It isn't a spectacular game, and I wouldn't consider it to be like a hidden gem or a forgotten classic or anything like that. It's a good port of an arcade game, which is what you would expect from early games on the NES. It has good controls and decent graphics, and it can be fun to play for a while. Kung Fu Heroes does have some issues that I think every arcade port has, specifically not having any continues, which can be pretty annoying when you're playing it. Despite its flaws, Kung Fu Heroes is a fun game, and it's an early example of a beat-em-up that was released really before the genres were created. If you're looking for something different, this might be the game for you. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.